to work on some solutions to problem number 2.
Woo.
So,
Just kidding.
start, our client is
Kentucky Farm Bureau.
Kentucky Farm Bureau. Okay. And how are we framing or defining the problem? Surely somebody has an idea, or either that or you're leaving, you've called up the Kentucky Farm Bureau and said you've decided to leave law practice and open a coffee shop in Bowling Green, right? Let me take a stab at it.
I'll take a sec.
Okay, go
It's a
for it.
really broad, I mean, it's water pollution in the Mississippi water basin.
Okay. Okay, so the problem is water pollution in the Mississippi River Basin. Okay. And there's a couple of ways that it's probably a little bit more specific than that. Is it all pollution? What are we specifically concerned about? Nutrients. Nutrients, okay? Or nitrogen and phosphorus. And when we talk about, actually there's another problem too. Okay, so in addition to nutrients, we're also concerned about what? Sediment. Yep. So soil and other particles that are running off. Okay, and why, by the way, why do we care about the sediment? It's cloudy, dirty, okay, but that's not really what we care about. We care about the sediment because, I'm sorry?
I was
Go for it.
going to say that there were problems with the level of the river.
Yes, exactly, right? It makes the river more shallow and it fills in the wetlands, okay? And by filling in the wetlands, that in turn has a relationship, a feedback loop with the nutrients because it means those wetlands aren't filtering out the nutrients because they're filled in, right? So there's aspects of this that really aren't nutrient-based. I mean, it has to do with level of river, loss of wetlands generally, but it also is less capacity to filter nutrients. Okay, good. All right. Now, it's not that we don't care about any other pollutants, but that's not really the problem that we've been tasked to address, right? I mean, there could be all sorts of other things, coal ash and, mercury and so on and so forth in the water. Not to say those aren't interesting and important issues, but that's not really what we've been asked to address. Okay? When we talk about the Mississippi River Basin, what is the sort of the focal point of our problem? Is it just, hey, it's a bad idea to have pollution in the Mississippi River Basin?
The hypoxic zone and the
Right. Okay. So the one of the big results of all of this is we have a Gulf hypoxic zone, an area that is quite large, like that's the size of an entire eastern state of one sort or another, varies whether it's New Jersey or Massachusetts or Connecticut or whatever, but a large area that is dead, that is lifeless, okay? That in which there is the inability to support life because the nutrients have created algae growth, which in turn have deprived this entire area of oxygen, and any aquatic species that can leave have left, and any aquatic species that can't leave have died. Okay, so bottom line. Now, having said that, as we kind of went along, we saw that there were some other things. We saw toxic algae blooms in the Ohio River. Okay? And more generally, there are issues of concentrations, right? So we've got cumulative and synergistic impacts. So this is pretty good, kind of medium level a statement of the problem. Let's dig a little deeper. Dig a little deeper. Why should we even care about a Gulf hypoxic zone? Why should we care if there are nutrients and sediment running down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers? Who cares? Pull back a little bit. What impact does any of this have? What impact does it have that affects our client? Nobody cares. All right. Well, I mean, it does. Come on, try something here.
Well, if the hypoxic zone persists, then federal regulators will step in, and our client is pretty much diametrically opposed to any kind of, especially federal, but also state regulation on any kind of nutrients that would run off.
Okay, so one concern is federal regulation of runoff sources of pollution. Okay, so this problem is substantial enough for the federal government, for society, for other stakeholders that it can lead to federal regulation, right? There is a Clean Water Act that does have sets of standards. There's been some litigation over this, and so one of our concerns is we, and the client's goals are no regulation. Okay. What else? Is there any way in which sort of a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, completely aside from regulation, just set that aside for a moment, is there any sense in which a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico is, or nutrient runoff or sediment runoff is bad for our clients?
Well, it's not particularly like to our client, but I guess in the end it might affect them, but local industries that there, especially like fishing, will be impacted, and then as the wetlands recede, those areas have less protection from hurricanes and stuff.
Okay, good. All right, so one thing is the fishing industry is very much affected. And so if, and to some degree, fishing and farming fall into a broad category of, you know, I don't want to say that they're they're close allies, but they're sort of loose allies in terms of food production and so forth, right? They do different kinds of things, but there are, I think, some areas in which the fishing industry and the agricultural industry and so forth cooperate and so forth. And so the concern is, if we end up in a scenario where sort of the framing of this whole thing is it's either farmers or fisheries, or the fisheries, right? Okay, farms or fisheries, right? And that's the way it comes across. That's going to be problematic for our client, right? I mean, there's all sorts of negative image issues, and that's just not very productive. There are going to be times in which, from a social, economic, legal, political standpoint, the farming community and the fishing community are going to need to cooperate, right? And so that's one issue. The fishing industry is definitely affected. Another issue is that loss of wetlands leads to more and worse flooding. And that's a problem for farms, right? I mean, so, if, yes, there's sediment running off from fields and it's ending up in the wetlands, and the wetlands are filling in and so forth, but there's a pretty direct negative feedback especially to the farms anywhere along those waterways. Now, maybe there's not a direct feedback loop for some farm that is smack dab in the middle of Kentucky and not going to be flooded by the Mississippi River, for example. But nonetheless, when we talk about sort of the agricultural community as a whole, there are plenty of farms along the Mississippi River that are concerned about the loss of wetlands, even though they are contributing to the loss of wetlands. Okay, so that's an issue. What else? Yeah.
The farming industry feels like they're being disproportionately blamed because even while they contribute to like a majority of the non-point source pollution, they feel like they're the ones kind of getting all the flack for it.
Okay, so there are issues of unfair blame. It's a big, complex problem, and they feel like they're sort of an easy target, and that's unfair, okay? So that's an issue. Let's kind of back up for just a moment, and we talked about the sort of how the sediment fills in the level of the river, and so forth. So, loss of navigability, how does that affect farmers?
Well, they can't get their product anywhere if they can't transport it.
Right. So what it means is a reduction in transportation options. Now, I think it would be overstating it to say that they have no other options, right? There's trucks, there's rail, there's, they can do short-term, closer markets, so on and so forth. There's various options, but as the ability to navigate the waterways decreases, that's going to decrease their potential to use navigation as a means of shipping their produce, which is going to lead to an increase in the cost of transportation. And so, again, think about they're going to put it on trucks, trains, airplanes, okay? So they're going to put their produce on trucks, trains, or airplanes, or whatever. Okay, fine, whatever. But if one of the major sources of transportation of these goods is substantially reduced, that's just basic supply and demand, right? All those other transportation options are going to increase in cost, okay, which is going to increase the cost of marketing your goods, right, and your client's goods, your client's farm products, it's going to increase in cost, and so that's going to have an effect. Okay? What else? Yeah.
Is it common for agricultural goods to be transported by water?
There are some. Yes. It depends on the product. It depends on where it's going and so forth. But yeah, no. I mean, you see cotton on barges all along the Mississippi all the time. So it depends on what it is. If you're talking about, are they getting, sort of fresh produce to restaurants in Nulu on the river? No, they're not doing that, right? I mean, it just sort of depends on what it is. It depends on, also, how, whether you need refrigeration or not, and so on and so forth. But yeah, but it does happen, and it does. I mean, and this has been an issue also with water rights. Okay, so farmers need water to grow crops and to keep livestock alive during times of severe drought. They find themselves in a conundrum because if there's not enough water flowing in rivers, they actually do. I mean, there's been news stories about this. They're losing their navigation options, and at the same time, so it's a sort of a conundrum. They need the water for their crops and their livestock. On the other hand, they're basically cutting off transportation options that they have. So that tells us. I mean, those news stories tell us that there is some significant enough use of navigation that it has an effect. Okay, so but I don't know what the percentages are and which ones and so forth. But anyway, so, okay, other issues. Yes.
If there's more and worse flooding, it won't just affect the farmland, it'll affect metropolitan areas as well. Granted, I'm assuming that these people would be somewhat close to metro areas. For like sewers and CSOs will cause flooding and even more exponential damage to the water, which is then brought to the hypoxic zone.
Exacerbate the problem. So again, sort of cumulative and synergistic impacts, right? So the more problems we have, the more they sort of exponentially interact with other related problems, and it just gets worse and worse. Okay, good. So, so now, I mean, we can keep going with this, but I mean, these are a variety of kind of cross-cutting issues that are relevant here. We'll talk a little bit more about the context in just a moment. So there's probably some more things that we could say, but let's sort of circle back then to think more broadly about exactly how a client goal-centric framing of the problem would be. So in terms of thinking about what the client wants, what is a way of sort of thinking through the problem, framing the problem that gets further than just water pollution in the Mississippi River Basin? What would the client want to see? If I had, if the Kentucky Farm Bureau had great legal representation and a really solid strategic plan, a variety of resources and so forth that we could put into this, in the end, what I would like to see is what? Okay, more financial and technological assistance, okay? That's going to be a piece of it. Assistance to do what? Assistance to do what?
To adopt more environmentally responsible practices.
Okay, adopt more environmentally responsible practices. Okay, so to adopt more environmentally responsible practices, how are we going to define that? Environmentally responsible practices of what?
Like runoff management?
Okay, runoff management. Where?
Near waterways?
Near waterways? Huh?
Near non-point sources, but not amounting to regulation.
Okay, all right. So a key piece of this is going to be non-regulatory, environmentally responsible practices, right? Okay, so basically they want to solve the problem, right? They want to figure out ways to find non-regulatory mechanisms, practices, solutions that will reduce nutrients, sediment, runoff, hypoxia in the Mississippi River Basin, right? In the Mississippi River Basin as an entire basin. Okay, so when you said near waterways, I'm going to say no, that's not right. That's actually not that's the wrong way of looking at it, right? The sources of all of this is coming from all over, everywhere, near and far, by big waters, small waters, right? And we know water's all over everywhere, especially in Kentucky, right? I mean, you can't walk more than a few feet and come across a stream or a creek or something, right? Okay, so the point here is they want a systemic, a basin-wide, okay, set of solutions that involve who? Involve who? What's that?
Farmers?
Farmers, okay, among others, but aren't they concerned about them being the target?
Well, the other polluters.
Everybody, right? Everybody. Aren't they wanting this to be for everybody to take responsibility? They want all levels of government. They want non-governmental actors. They want everybody from the fisheries to the sewer systems to the suburban developments to everybody, right? Because then they're not the sole target, right? We want everybody to take responsibility in some way, as opposed to putting the responsibility on the farmers. So, basin-wide, multi-stakeholder, non-regulatory, environmentally responsible practices that reduce nutrient runoff and sediment runoff in the Mississippi River Basin, right? So everybody see that is a way of sort of framing the problem that really gets at what their goal is, right? Something that, and they do want to be involved, right? They want to have a big say in it, but in terms of influencing the solutions, not solely being responsible for or paying for the solutions. Right? So that's you sort of see that's going to be how the Kentucky Farm Bureau. Okay, and so why not just sort of take a resistance only? Well, so we've talked about some problems, right? There are ways that they're affected by this, right? Okay, but the other point that we haven't yet brought up is regulatory, institutional, political, socioeconomic change over time. Okay? Short-term resistance is, as it says, a short-term strategy at best. It's not a very good long-term strategy because in the end, there's going to be political, economic, social pressures to deal with the situation. And if you are seen primarily as being the obstacle, the primary obstacle to any solution, at some point, even if you are powerful now, you're not going to be powerful later. You're just going to get run over by the forces that say, hey, it's now time to fix this, okay? And that time might not be anytime soon, right? I mean, farmers can maybe make a whole lot of money in the short run by not being regulated and so forth, but in the long run, we just see this. We see this pattern in all of this, right? And by the way, I mean, just want to, you know, I mean, while we're here, the flip side is true for the environmental activist community, right? The environmental activist community at sometimes is more influential, but then at other times, they're out in the wilderness, sort of shut out from power, from influence, and so on and so forth, right? And so you've got to think through the idea that, you know, the institutions are going to go through iterations, they're going to change over time. Okay? All right. So your client is looking for you to come up with a set of solutions. So let's just, you know, we've talked about some of the context, okay? So there's, you know, already we've identified some of the social and political and economic context of this. Just let's talk a little bit more about the ecological context. Okay, so when we talk about the Mississippi River Basin, what are we talking about?
The culmination of lots of other river basins and natural landforms, and it's huge.
It's enormous, absolutely. Okay, I mean, even though that's obvious, you've just got to say it, right? I mean, as a lawyer coming up with a plan, a set of strategies, you've just got to clearly address up front the obvious point, which is the Mississippi River Basin is huge. It's just enormous. And there are lots and lots of sources, not only in terms of types and numbers of sources, but also in terms of geographic scale, geographic spread. And what that means is what we know about how watersheds as ecosystems work, as hydrological systems, is they're nested, right? And so you have lots of subbasins and watersheds and subwatersheds and small catchments that make up the Mississippi River Basin. So that's going to present for us some both opportunities and challenges about how you deal with this, right? Because if you try to tackle it solely on a large basin scale, it's huge, it's overwhelming, right? It's too complex. On the other hand, if you break it down and you just do small scale, you may never actually be achieving your sort of systemic basin-wide goals, right? And so if all you do is, make some improvements in Beargrass Creek over here, and make some improvements in the Green River over there, and so forth, that may be way too incremental and too myopic, too narrow in view, okay? So you've got a tension there, okay? So that's part of the ecological context. The other part of the ecological context is that you're really talking about things that are sort of widely used, right? Fertilizers, human waste, pet waste, animal waste, right? You can even have sort of rotting vegetation that puts off some of this stuff. Sediment, it's just soil, right? Any sort of disturbed soil. So you're dealing with a lot of things that are pretty common. This is not, some sort of, horrible toxic pollutant coming from some chemical manufacturing facility, right? Okay, so it can result in toxics, right? We talked about toxic algae blooms. So this can end up being toxic to humans, but it's because of the algae growth. The actual pollutants themselves are pretty common everyday stuff. And so you want to just observe that, right? I mean, it's a different kind of environmental problem than, say, when the Cuyahoga River was catching fire, right? So we see that issue, okay? Institutional context. some of the institutional context, okay? So institutions, remember, are sort of the rules and systems of decision making. So that's governance, policy, planning, laws, informal norms. What's the context of the institutions? Again, sort of say the ultra obvious. It's the ultra obvious. Okay, let me ask you, is there a system of rules that applies?
Yes.
Okay, some of you say yes. Anybody want to say no? You got deadly quiet. Okay, the answer is no. Okay, it's not a system. It is a lot of systems, right? Right? Does everybody, right? So again, when we talk about complexity, we not only have ecological complexity, a social complexity, we also have institutional complexity. Okay, so let's think about it. Which federal agencies are involved?
EPA.
EPA, Army Corps of Engineers, for sure, right? U.S. Department of Agriculture, right? Natural Resource Conservation Service is involved, okay? All right? If any of this is affecting endangered aquatic species, now all of a sudden we have U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA, right? The National Marine Fisheries Service, right? Which is within the U.S. Department of Commerce. Okay, so already that's 5 totally different departments. You're not even talking about the agencies within, but that's 5 different departments within the federal government, right? Okay? And rules that get made by the federal government get made by
Congress.
Congress.
Agencies.
Congress, the agencies, and the courts. The courts, right? Right. So we were Rapinos and so on and so forth, right? Okay. So you're like Professor Arnold. Yeah, right. Separation of powers, right? This, sort of the 3 branches of government. This is like Schoolhouse Rock stuff, but it's important, right? Because there is no one branch of the federal government. And we're just at the federal government level, but there's no one branch that is controlling all the rules, right? Does everybody see that? Okay, and Congress can't possibly come up with specific enough rules to govern everything, so the agencies are going to have to be involved. But, then they bump up against, the authority and limits on their authority and challenges to agency action and so on and so forth, constitutionality of statute. And so the courts are going to be involved. All right. That's the federal government. What about state governments? Right? So remember, one of the things we said is the Clean Water Act is premised on the delegation of federal authority pursuant to federal standards to the state governments. State governments have really substantial roles in implementing and enforcing the Clean Water Act. Right, so that in and of itself is noteworthy. Sometimes this is called cooperative federalism or dynamic federalism, but the idea here is that just from our study of the Clean Water Act, when it comes to federal law, states have a role. In addition, the states have their own laws. And we talked about the fact that the state of Kentucky has a nutrient management statute that applies to farms of a certain size in Kentucky that actually goes above and beyond what the federal law requires, which is interesting and it's noteworthy, but it certainly says that the states are involved. The other thing that you know from the reading is when you look at the Mississippi River Basin Initiative, the MRBI, there's these federal agencies, but then there's all these states, And the whole idea is to get cooperation from the states in solving the problem. Okay, so that's the state government. Side point is MRBI also involves some Indian tribes that are sort of in a sort of unique role as sort of sovereigns within the U.S. To some degree, they have their own legal status and authority. In other ways, the law has sort of treated Native American tribes in a sort of a subservient kind of way. So that creates some complexity. What role do the tribes play? What role should they play? And so forth. Then there's local government, right? And we already know that there are all kinds of issues surrounding land development and local sewer systems and so forth. So local government's going to have a role to play. Well, just think about all the local governments across the entire Mississippi River Basin. That's huge. It's huge, right? And so that's another layer of just institutions. Other institutions. Other institutions. What else is out there? When we talk about law, right, one of the things that we see with law is there are questions about, there's rules about the authority that different actors have, usually government entities. There are rules about restrictions or regulations that apply to various actors. So that could be government, it could be private actors, it could be farmers, right? And so we've got authority, we've got restrictions or regulations and those sorts of things, and not just regulations per se, but just restrictions, prohibitions on behavior or requirements. You must do this, that kind of thing. And then you also have issues related to remedies, enforcement remedies, liability for certain things, right? And so that's a whole nother kind of dimension just of law itself, right? Okay, so the bottom line here is basically that the institutional arrangements are every bit as complex as the ecological and social components, right? So that's just sort of the bottom line. What I'm trying to get across there. All right, so again, that makes it challenging to come up with a set of solutions that are really going to solve the problem, right? There's not one easy, recognized lever. If you just pull this lever, it's now going to solve the whole problem, right? Okay, so that's, well, welcome to environmental law. That's exactly the challenge. That's why we've been dealing all semester. Okay, so let's now think through what are some possible solutions that we might put forward, and then we can analyze. So what are some possible solutions?
I mean, this one's kind of specific, but I said subsidized equipment purchases that would incentivize no-till farming.
Okay, all right. So broadly, subsidies of environmentally responsible and what we're going to call BMPs, best management practices, right? And so no-till farming is one, right? And you need certain kinds of equipment for that, but we could sort of expand upon that, right? We could think of a whole variety of things. But we're talking about government subsidies, taxpayer-funded subsidies to facilitate farmers to engage in best management practices of a variety of sorts, of more environmentally responsible farming practices. Okay? And you could list several different examples, but you probably don't want to limit it just to that, right? I mean, any of those, unless you happen to be, a great expert on, all of the various BMPs for farmers, you might sort of give an illustrative list, and more things could be added, right? Okay, so good. What else? We'll come back to to talk about that. But so, okay, subsidies. Very good.
You could try and use maybe like municipal governmental tools to not necessarily regulate yourself as a small farmer, but you can use them to regulate maybe larger CAFOs or other land use practices like retention basins, you know, maybe to just try and limit the amount of runoff that way without targeting yourself.
Okay, so various kinds of land use regulation at the local level, right? And a lot of agricultural practices are either exempt and so forth. So what you're getting at are either the major contributors like CAFOs, or you're getting at the contributions of the developed community and the so forth, right? The CFOs and the sewer systems of the all the land development and so forth. Okay, what else?
We partner with more activists and advocacy groups that have a focus on farming, as opposed to like the big federal regulators.
Good. Partnerships with other stakeholders. Good. Okay, good. And that has two components. One's an advocacy component, and one is a practices. BMP's kind of, can you cooperate to do better things, restoration and riparian buffers and that kind of thing. Okay, so good. What else?
This isn't a solution that our client would like, but it's one which would be some kind of command and control regulation from the federal government.
Okay, so we need to consider that our power is somewhat limited, that the government may engage in command and control regulation that goes beyond what we see now. Okay, right? I mean, one could say, well, they could keep doing what they're doing, but really, they're not doing that much at the moment, right? But in terms of command and control regulation, what is likely to be on the horizon? It's likely to be on the horizon. We talked about it several times. Numeric water quality standards and TMDLs. Okay? Now, it's conceivable that Congress would amend the Clean Water Act to cover non-point source runoff. I don't think that's particularly likely in our lifetime. Right? I think it's once you give something, it's very hard to have the political will to take it away. Right? Because you see where I'm coming from in that. And the agricultural industry is politically powerful in both of the major political parties. Okay, so I don't see the end of the exemption for non-point sources, but numeric water quality standards and TMDLs, which of course is going to force regulations, to force states to regulate, right? Right, which is in turn forces state regulation. Okay? So in terms of our client, we want to analyze, but we also want resist and challenge, strategies to resist and challenge, right? So this takes us into analysis of the Clean Water Act, and it also takes us into the whole arena of the APA and litigation challenging an agency's actions. If the EPA took this action, what would we need to marshal on behalf of our client in order to mount a legal challenge, right? So we want to talk a little bit about about the Clean Water Act and about the APA, and and other things, standing and ripeness and that kind of stuff. Remember that because this will affect us economically, we are actually in a better position to have standing than the environmental groups do, right? Remember some of that Bennett versus Spear and some of those cases, just to remind you about that, okay? All right. Other thoughts? There are a couple of other big ones, big solutions.
You can try, I don't know how it would work on farming, at like a small-time farmer's level, but you can do like a market-based solution, like using the pollution trading credits.
Yeah.
But given that it's only the big boy and big girl farmers trading to each other, then maybe there's more work and maybe more legwork for you to do.
Okay, water quality pollution credit trading and similar market solutions. I'm actually going to, it is true that you get economies of scale with larger farms, but I'm going to push back on the idea that the smaller farms would actually not participate well in here. It depends on how it's structured. But actually there's tremendous potential because it depends partly on where they are, what kind of practices they currently are engaged in, but you can actually achieve some pretty significant improvements. And oftentimes any amount of money that you get for trading credits, if you're a small-scale farmer, make a big difference to your bottom line in a way that if you're a large-scale farmer, it's just a drop in the bucket, right? You see the point there? So I'm going to push back on the idea that the small-scale folks would be disinterested in this. However, they're going to need more support, right? So not just financial support, but also, technical assistance, training and scientific, technological expertise and that kind of thing, okay? What else? Okay, remember, one of our issues here has to do with wetlands. We were talking about land development and so forth. So another big one land and wetland conservation, restoration, and management. So some strategies all centered around land conservation and wetland conservation. And I mentioned both because the wetlands play a very important particular role, and they are different than dry land, okay? But in many ways, if you're going to reduce nutrient runoff, you're going to have to do both, right? You're going to have lands that are not developed, that are not generating nutrient runoff, lands that are serving as detention, retention zones, filtration functions, those kinds of things, right? Use of vegetation and so forth. So that can be private, it can be public, it can be voluntary, it could be mandatory, right? So there you could talk about everything from land trust and conservation easements, right, to local land use regulations, to Section 404, to maybe even use of management of federal lands for the overall health and function of the basin. So, the one that's sort of really close and obvious is, could we do more with how we manage Mammoth Cave National Park to improve, sort of, mostly I think what we would be doing is trying to filter out nutrients coming down the Green River, right? And so you could think about, hey, the National Park Service could do something, right? We studied, that was last unit, but it's relevant here. It's not a big thing, right? I mean, because there's lots and lots of lands that are not, we're not in the western part of the United States. There's lots and lots of lands that are not federal lands, but it's still something. And certainly private land conservation using things like conservation easements and land trusts could be pretty significant. Okay? All right. So you get the idea, a variety of different kinds of possible solutions here, and you know, a variety of ways in which the environmental law that you've learned so far, which, and I'm going to put law in quotes because some of it is, you know, true traditional law, and some of it is, you know, about more policy and, you know, sort of multi-stakeholder cooperative techniques and stuff. But you know, there might be a variety of different possible solutions. So how are you going to want to kind of pull this all together? Okay, seems like we've talked about a bunch of stuff, right? And there's a fair amount there. It could just look like, you know, kind of an encyclopedia. Right? It could just look like, I know there's not encyclopedias. It could look like sort of pages and pages of various Wikipedia entries. Okay, how's that for more contemporary, right? No, I mean, right? It could just be a lot of different stuff. How would we pull this together in a way that would help our client? So there's several different options here, but just sort of think through. Okay, bottom line. You're walking to dinner, or you're going up the elevator, something building taller than this one, but right, but something, right? You're at the golf house, you're going up the elevator, or something like that, right? You've got a short period of time to give your client sort of the bottom line about what recommendations you're making, what your solutions are for your client, your strategic plan for them. What's it going to be? What are you going to say? Let's think about how to pull all that together. Yeah.
Well, if one of your goals implicitly is to reduce all of these pollutants without having like a regulatory solution guide you,
yes.
then you should consider the possibilities of like what combinations of agreements or partnerships that you can use that the feds can't touch.
Right. Okay. So there's three parts to what Pierce just said. So one is the toolbox idea. Again, whether you call it toolbox, whether you call it multimodal, you call it just multiple solutions. But one piece of that is that you want a variety of strategies, because none of these by themselves is going to take us far enough, right? So you want multiple strategies, but you want to focus on ones that are non-regulatory, right? And that are somehow insulated from top-down federal control. Okay, I think it's a fair thing to say that your client, while they like to take federal funds if they're made available, they tend to be relatively skeptical from a more sort of cultural standpoint to federal control. They do not want Washington, D.C. controlling them, really regardless of who is in control in Washington, right? They'd rather it be more local, more private, but certainly not the federal government, right? Okay, so that's key, right? All right, very good. It's another sort of way so I think that's one way to frame a solution, right? A way to pull it all together. Another one. Okay, if you're going to have all of these sort of non-regulatory components, what do you need in order to make them happen? Make them happen.
Like an entity that goes ahead of you. You need a partnership with some kind of local agency that knows the framework of the government and where the loopholes are, and someone that has a voice with the federal government that can give you ideas of what they're thinking and how you can go about this or that.
Okay, so one idea is you need a partner that has power, that has authority, that has capacity to navigate the system. Okay, so that's one possibility. You could sort of think about sort of a partnership with a particular entity.
This might be off, but voluntary acts by people that you want to buy into what you're saying.
Right. So a big one is cooperation, right? Involving multiple participants voluntarily, cooperatively, right? So you want to think about how you would design a set of solutions that are really going to maximize cooperation among a range, a wide range of diverse voluntary stakeholders, voluntary participants, right? Okay, so that's going to be key. So whether you have one sort of key leading partner or you have cooperation among a whole variety of stakeholders or both, okay, in order to make any of this happen, you're going to need I've heard that. Wait. Money. Yes. Okay. Money. And more probably a little bit more broadly, resources. So money, but also personnel, innovation, expertise, knowledge, etc. Right? Okay. So but money's key. Financial resources are key, but other resources as well. Right? So one way to think about this is about sort of thinking in terms of cooperation and partnerships and investment of resources. How can you design a system that's got both of those happening? Maybe the federal government has lots and lots of resources to invest, but more likely you're going to need to leverage the cooperation in order to leverage resources, right? Right? So that's another way to kind of think about it. Why are we, I mean, you're like, oh my gosh, Professor Arnold, this is no longer the Supreme Court, and why are we talking about this? Well, this is what environmental law is. This is how we deal with it. I mean, yes, we get into the nitty-gritty of what the Clean Water Act says, and we haven't even yet talked about NEPA, but some of this might involve environmental impact analysis, right? Okay, that's probably in this kind of set of solutions something that you could mention lightly as opposed to requiring pages of analysis, but it's nonetheless it's a relevant point that if you have a federal agency involved making major federal actions, they may have to do an environmental impact study. So there is all that, but the point here is that your client, I mean, this is a complex problem, and your client wants a set of solutions, wants you to bring them a set of solutions that will help them shape how this problem is addressed, right? The Kentucky Farm Bureau wants influence over this, right? Does that make sense to everybody? I mean, that's really kind of a key piece of what's going on here. Yes, they could hire you just to fight the Gulf Restoration Network case, right? I mean, they could do that, just hire you to be the litigator on the Gulf Restoration Network case, but that's a particular type of representation. What they've asked you, what the problem calls for you to do, is to come up with a more proactive set of strategies. Okay? So, questions? Have one, which is why on earth is the rest of this building so darn cold and this room is so hot? What's up with that? Okay, sorry. All right, Kirk.
Is the Endangered Species Act implicated at all?
Yeah, so and I briefly mentioned that earlier, but yes, if you have aquatic species that are being harmed by the nutrients and or the sediments, right? Including sort of the direct result of the nutrients, which is the hypoxia, whether it's in the Ohio or down at the Gulf. Yeah, so that is going to be that would be that would implicate the Endangered Species Act, right? So, but the question is, when you've got a diffuse set of contributors, who actually do you enforce the ESA against, right? So what you would expect to see happen here is somewhere down the line, there's going to be an environmental group that is going to sue the EPA for failing to protect endangered aquatic species from nutrient runoff. I mean, they're not going to sue the farmers, they're not going to sue every resident of the entire Mississippi River Basin, right? The political fallout of that would be, I mean, it would kill off the environmental movement, and it would be silly, and a court would throw it out. So, but what they would say is that the EPA has an affirmative duty to set numeric water quality standards and require the states to set TMDLs in order to protect the species. Okay, so what do we know about how that's going to be analyzed? Okay, so again, there has to be a claim under the APA, right? Okay, so we're looking at the relationship between the ESA and the APA, and what they're going to say, how the court's going to analyze this is, does the EPA have a non-discretionary duty, right? Because it's failure to act that's being challenged, right? So the question is, does the EPA have a non-discretionary duty to do this? I think the result of that lawsuit will depend on two things. First of all, which court or courts decide it, okay? I mean, so we haven't really talked that much about that, but I mean, honestly, you get different kinds of decisions depending on who the judges are, okay? So I think that's going to be one question. The other question is going to be, to what extent can the plaintiffs present strong evidence, factual-based evidence, that would show that if the EPA did this, it would actually have some effect on decreasing the threat of extinction to those species, right? I mean, so it's a causation kind of issue. Does that make sense? Okay? Right, so that would be the challenge. But the fact that there could be an ESA suit down the road, right? That's put that over here too, is again another reason why the Kentucky Farm Bureau wants a set of strategies that will get you out ahead of that, right? Because the best defense is the EPA is already doing a lot of things to prevent the possibility of extinction of the species. They're doing all these cooperative measures, these, so on and so forth. So that would be the argument that they would make, if that makes sense. They also would, of course, challenge the environmental group's standing. I mean, how much does the environmental group actually, observe or see, enjoy the, dead mussels in the bottom of the Mississippi River or whatever, right? You see that kind of, right, that issue, right? Other questions? Okay, so, this is good, right? I mean, it took a little while to get going. Everybody's kind of getting them, but this is very good. So again, I just want to emphasize, there's complexity. There's a lot to this. You have to sort of think through it, right? There's a lot of dimensions, right? That's the whole point. But there's no mystery, at least as far as the course goes, in terms of what we're aiming to do here, you know, how you're going to be assessed or evaluated. I guess one thing we sort of danced around, I guess I should probably mention, is diverse perspectives, but we talked a little bit about, you know, the issues of the farmers' perspectives, right, and kind of how they feel like maybe they get blamed and so forth. We might note that there could, in terms of dealing with either effects on urban areas or effects on the fishing industry, we could end up with, you know, sort of effects on groups that tend to be, you know, more marginalized, come, you know, at this from, you know, different kinds of perspectives. So, for example, one of the groups that is especially challenged by the Gulf hypoxic zone, we haven't really talked about it, but I'll just put it out there. One of the groups that is especially challenged by the problems with fishing in the Gulf of Mexico are Vietnamese American fishers along the Gulf, along, you know, the New Orleans and Mississippi and Alabama and so forth. They do quite a bit of fishing, but because they're more small scale, more economically marginal, they don't have as much, you know, political and economic power as sort of the big industries, and so therefore less able to affect or to protect themselves. Well, why should the Kentucky Farm Bureau care about that? Well, you know, again, it creates some issues of, you know, are they really cooperative? Does the Farm Bureau appear to the public like they're cooperatively trying to solve the problem? So that's an issue out there as well. Okay. Anything else?
So just practically speaking, like, we get this list of potential solutions and analyze ways in which we can kind of pull it all together. But then in our capacity as a lawyer, what happens after that? Like, we just give that to a Farm Bureau and say, "You run with it."
Right. Good luck. You're right. Pay my bill, and you know, I'm going to be down vacationing on the Gulf. No, right. So no. Okay. So it's a very good practical question. And so I mean, so here's the thing: is as far as our class goes, right? Then that's where it ends, right? Because I want to have a clear, bright line for the class, right? I mean, so that people don't feel like, you know, they've entered the you know, final paper project that never ends, right? But practically, from a professional practice standpoint, what you're trying to do as a lawyer who needs to continue to you know, make money and support yourself and so on and so forth, is you're wanting to position yourself to help your client then go about pursuing these strategies and these solutions and all the way along, right? So you want to be, you don't want to basically create such a roadmap that then some other lawyer can take it over and you've basically done their work for them, right? I mean, so there are, I mean, there could be issues related, as we talked about, what we saw in the Guide to Legal Problem Solving. There's some things that go beyond what we do, which are things like, you know, implement the solutions, and evaluate their outcomes. And so you can, you know, there's various steps along the way. But as a lawyer, what you want to do is just make yourself as invaluable to your client. Now, you want to be careful. You're not trying to manipulate your client into paying for services that they don't really need, right? You want to be careful there. There's an ethical line. But on the other hand, you're not, you know, ethics doesn't require you to sort of, you know, sit back and say, well, gee, you know, I hope one of these days maybe you'd use me again as your lawyer, right? I mean, no. I mean, you want to sort of say, here, I've put together this really great strategy, and you should not be at all reluctant to refer to your strategy as a very promising one, right? I mean, don't undersell yourself, right? Don't undersell your work product, right? I mean, you guys are bright, you're talented, you know a lot about environmental law and the environmental problem solving, you're going to come up with something good, right? And then you want to sort of position yourself for that to be continual ongoing work with that client. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So, but yes, of course, just because you've come up with this document, that's not the end of the story. It's not self-implementing. Anything else? All right. Okay. So next week we dive into problem number 3. So we really do literally go to the Gulf of Mexico, to the Tampa area, and we'll turn to some more urban type of problems.